joining us here on The Big Story this afternoon. Let's tell you the big news here today is the announcement coming from the United Kingdom. UK is the first country in the world to announce that they have given approval to the Pfizer BioTech vaccine for emergency use in the first phase of rollout of a COVID-19 vaccine. Now, this is a major development in the fight against COVID. The UK government has granted an emergency approval to the Pfizer's COVID vaccine. It will be made available across the country from next week onwards. This comes at a time when the entire world is racing against time to find a safe and efficacious vaccine for COVID-19. And talking specifically about India, there are a number of candidates in various stages of trial at the moment. The government is also trying to fast-track the process of rolling out a vaccine. In fact, there is another big announcement that has come in this regard, which is literally taken in with a lot of shock and surprise by many when the Health Ministry now announced that the entire country will not require to be vaccinated. Only a limited number of what it calls critical mass will be immunized. The entire population will not be vaccinated, and that the government never planned to do so in the first place. ICMR director also said that the priority of the vaccine drive is to break the transmission chain, and if that is achieved by vaccinating a critical mass of population, the remaining population may not require vaccines at all.
मैं केवल एक प्रारंभिक जानकारी आपको दे देता हूं, उसके बाद फिर डॉक्टर भार्गव बताएंगे। पूरे देश के टीकाकरण की बात सरकार ने कभी नहीं की है। आई जस्ट वांटेड टू मेक दैट क्लियर। मैं बार बार ये कहता हूं कि इस प्रकार के जो साइंटिफिक विषय होते हैं, साइंस से संबंधित विषय होते हैं, उस पर जब हम चर्चा करते हैं तो ये बेहतर होता यदि हम पहले इस तरह की जो तथ्यात्मक जानकारी है, फैक्चुअल इन्फॉर्मेशन, उसको हासिल कर लें, उसके बाद फिर विश्लेषण करें। तो पूरे देश के टीकाकरण की बात कभी नहीं कही गई है।
Our purpose is to break the chain of virus transmission. So if we are able to vaccinate a critical mass of people and break that virus transmission, then we may not have to vaccinate the entire population.
Right, so two big developments today, viewers. UK has cleared its vaccine. India is trying to fast-track its process, but in the meanwhile, the government of India announces that only a limited number of quote-unquote critical mass will be vaccinated. To help us understand these developments, I am being joined by Professor Sudhir Krishna from the National Centre for Biological Sciences from Bengaluru, and also Dr. Anish Sinha, Associate Professor, IIPH, that is the Indian Institute of Public Health from Gandhinagar, who's worked with WHO and the UNDP for vaccines and immunization. I welcome the two of you. Thank you so much for joining us here on Mirror Now. Professor Sudhir Krishna, if I may ask you the big question which is in everyone's minds right now, especially after the announcement that came from ICMR that only a limited group of carefully identified critical mass need to be vaccinated. There is no need to vaccinate the entire population, and therefore the big question would be, who would qualify for the vaccine once it is announced in India?
Well, thanks for having me on your show. I've been consistently on the channel saying three things. We should keep multiple vaccine candidates open. We should do targeted vaccination in a very strategic manner. And third, that innovation is critical to the whole process. So there's no magic moment when you have a vaccine and then you just roll it out. There's a learning curve, and the learning curve is continuous, actually. So let's take the third bit right now, because that's what we're focusing on. The idea really, in a sense, is a flip. If you had a super spreader event which was bothering you before, what you're really looking now are for immune amplifiers. You're literally looking at the inverse of what was happening earlier on. So how do you identify these immune amplifiers, either at the level of the individuals or the community? It doesn't mean that there's a super immune response. What it really means is that, I think the DG ICMR identified it as breaking the transmission dynamics. And the transmission dynamics has to be broken in multiple ways. I think the first thing that we need to do is an analysis from our data of what is the serology and the transmission dynamics that we know. So even if our models are imperfect, we should take those imperfect models and make a strategy. It's absolutely unfeasible to make a 1.3 billion vaccination strategy. It's not even necessary. An intelligent, reasonable, good attempt, which is well-meaning, well communicated to the public, that this is a learning curve, and from this learning curve, we will take the next step. I think it's a very fair way to go. I can tell you as we move along this show how we can choose these targeted populations.
So yes, important. Yes.
So herd immunity. So remember two things about herd immunity.
I'm also joined by Dr. Anish Sinha. Yes, we'll just come back to you on that point. I want to bring in Dr. Anish Sinha as well. Dr. Anish Sinha, we were just talking about how there is a certain transmission dynamic which has to be studied, and based on those inputs, there has to be a model designed on how the vaccination program will roll out in India. It has to be done intelligently, is what we just heard Professor Sudhir Krishna telling us. I want to know from you, the other big news that has come out today is the United Kingdom announcing that they have given the license for the Pfizer BioTech vaccine. How is that going to be relevant for India? Is it going to be useful to study how they do it, how they roll out, and how they actually, go about this entire process? Can we draw lessons from how the UK has come to this stage?
Yeah, it's a big news today. And first, we look at the UK, what they have been doing, and then coming back to our country. So they become the first country to place an order, and they'll be starting the vaccination, the COVID vaccine. So regarding the issue that we have been discussing in our country from yesterday regarding who will be vaccinated and whether the whole country. So look, UK also have prioritized their population. Going by the epidemiology and the mortality of the COVID. So what they have been planning to vaccinate first priority, the people who are at the highest risk or the deaths in which category were more. Like they will be immunizing first the home care, those engaged in the home care works, and then those who are 80 plus, they have a huge elderly population, and mortality was also very high. And then those involved in the national health system, those working for that. So because the disease has affected adversely among these categories, so they will be going first among them and then to the rest of the population. They have planned to vaccinate their entire population. Accordingly, they are going ahead with them. Coming back to our country, we also have to look into our data systems, whatever we have generated over last 10 months for the COVID. And the whole priority at the moment is to reduce the number of deaths and to save our health system. That is the top priority at the moment. And if you look at the data which is available, we have seen that mortality, the percentage of deaths were much more among the healthcare workers compared to a general population. So they are at higher risk. Similarly, if you look at the deaths among those who are above 50 years of age group, 80% of all COVID-related deaths have been in those above 50 years of age. And similarly, those with the comorbid. So what I understand with the current scenario in our country, it will be practically impossible, may not be required also to run after 1.3 billion population. So prioritize, vaccinate them, and the day will reach a critical level that there is a concept called the herd immunity that will come into play. So that's fair enough. The government is targeting at the moment to prioritize and ensure that.
So that is the point Professor Sudhir Krishna was also making about the point of herd immunity. And I want to know, realistically speaking, Professor Krishna, are we, like we just heard that our situation is very different. This is a different demography. We have different climatic conditions. The same vaccine is probably not going to work here. But I want to know from you, what is the larger aim here? Is it to reduce mortality, like we just heard, to restrict the spread and control, and not just to make our country COVID-free immediately, because that might look like a tall order? Will the COVID protocols continue even after we roll out a vaccine?
COVID, so there are three possibilities when you vaccinate, right? A, you prevent infection. The second, you reduce, in some sense, the severity. And the third, you prevent fatalities. And you have to analyze each three. And the point point about having multiple vaccines is it's quite likely that different vaccines in different age groups will do different things to different people. Some of these vaccines might work better at the T cell level. Some of these vaccines might work better at generating antibodies. And it's sort of very important that we do immune analysis and immune signatures using all kinds of new technologies, work with the IITs, for example, to generate artificial intelligence models so that we can actually make predictions of immune signatures. But I want to come back to one of the counterintuitive questions, which I think is at the heart of this argument.
Yes.
If you're going herd immunity approach, you're essentially targeting a population which is not the most vulnerable. So independent of your frontline workers who fall ill, the population that you're targeting in a herd immunity is actually your mobile population, the population which tends to transmit the virus as opposed to the largest incidence of people who get affected. And this is a slightly counterintuitive, but it's a challenge because you're actually, at this point, not saying that I'm targeting the most vulnerable. What you're saying is that I'm doing this for the community good. And I think it's important to get this message across that all vaccinations, and I've said this multiple times on your channels, that all historical vaccinations have actually been herd protection vaccinations. Nobody has ever vaccinated every single person on the planet to eliminate a disease. So identify your mobile population, identify the target groups, start the process, examine the transmission dynamics, and go to the next stage.
That's a very important point. Also, just to counter another follow-up question to that, in which everyone's asking that those who've already contracted the virus have shown presence of antibodies, are they to be necessarily excluded from the vaccination program?
So there are two ways of thinking about it. One is your immune response which you generate to the infection exactly the same as the immune response that you generate from the vaccine? The answer is that we don't actually know right now. So I would actually frame this as a question to be asked, that is to categorize people who are seropositive, people who are not seropositive, and track their immune response in terms of immune amplification, in terms of the various parameters of the immune cells. I don't think anybody in the world right now can categorically say whether the vaccination that they use, whether it's a single vaccine or any other vaccine, matches the infection outcomes at all. I mean, this is one of the questions that we need to ask and ask well.
Okay. Absolutely. Dr. Anish Sinha, on the other side, there is again another issue that is being discussed on whether we are better off with an indigenously developed vaccine, our own candidate, or should we go by the tried and tested models and, you know, follow what the other countries are doing? If they manage to successfully roll out and if it works for them, it should work for us?
Yeah, we have some advantage as there are almost at the moment 5 vaccines which are under different stages in our country and and different stages of trials. Now, going by what UK has done or the Pfizer Moderna sort of vaccines, they cold chain that the temperature that required to store them is ultra low temperatures. That's -70 for Pfizer, -20°C for Moderna. So that may not be very feasible at the moment for our country because of we don't have that at presently that infrastructure of storing at such low temperatures. The vaccines which are being developed in our country, including that Oxford AstraZeneca, the Serum Institute vaccine, and the other, the Covaxin, the Zycov-D, the Sputnik, and others which are being trialed in our country or being developed, they can be stored at the temperature at +2 to +8 degrees. And we have our immunization system in line with that, the infrastructure. So this looks to me, though the efficacy may be lower than them, but then efficacy is only in the clinical trial sort of a things. We actually have to look for the effectiveness and at a later stage also the coverage of the vaccines, how much we can cover. So yes, I'm very optimistic with the Indian trialed or manufactured vaccines also.
So I'd like to come in on this if I can a little bit.
Okay, very optimistic with the Indian trials. Yes, please go ahead. Yes, please go ahead.
I'd like to make 2 points out here. The problem is if you decide to have multiple vaccines, say you use a mRNA vaccine here, and you make the case that I cannot use an mRNA vaccine all over the country for distribution reasons, so I should not use it. I think that's not a good argument. I think we should actually communicate the idea that if you, for example, use a DNA vaccine or an mRNA vaccine, there are certain urban centers. The army, for example, is very capable of handling a cold chain. And if we are going to get high efficacy, then we should use the mRNA vaccine, say, for example, in small urban areas and the army. Because the point that we are making is that this is not an inequity argument. If you make the argument that you're giving highly expensive vaccines in urban areas and you're giving bad vaccines in the rural areas, then it's a terrible argument. But if you make the argument that this is a vaccine which can be delivered in certain contexts, will actually provide immunity at the herd immunity level to the whole country, then I'm sure people will understand what we're doing. I mean, I don't think we should not treat people as people who cannot follow things. I think I'm amazed at the level that people are following everything, and I think we should make good arguments. We should make nuanced arguments. And the one point that I forgot to add, that the mRNA innovation
All right,
is something that
closing
we should
comments from, yes, sure. Right. Okay, closing comments from Dr. Anish Sinha as well on this. And also on another point about how far behind are we from where UK is today. As somebody who's handled public health emergency situations of this nature, what stage in the timeline are we, and can you give us, do you envisage us announcing a rollout anytime soon, and how soon can that be?
UK has also been undergoing with the emergency use of the vaccine, and as per some information from the Serum Institute, within 2 weeks they'll also be applying for emergency use authorization. So maybe they've also manufactured almost 4 crore doses of vaccine. So as per my opinion, I think by January end, we may also start with our top priority population getting this vaccine. That's the earliest. I hope that from January end, we can start this for the risk population. So that's all.
All right. So that's quite optimistic. And of course, it gives us a lot of hope that India will be able to also make, and of course, the Prime Minister himself said that it's going to be accuracy over speed. And we know with the mishap that had happened with COVID Shield, there are more grueling, stringent protocols now being followed for the approval. So let's hope that once the announcement is made, there is an efficient rollout based on scientific studies like both the learned gentlemen just shared with us. Thank you so much, the two of you, for joining us and sharing your views.